Budget 2016, Team North Bloc came face-to-face with India Inc. Sparks flew as they crashed over taxes and reforms. The big talking point was tackling the bad loan menace. Minister of State for Finance Jayant Sinha assured India Inc. on the recapitalization plan and also assured them that banks would be back in good health quite soon. Here's an excerpt of the evening that was.
We have worked very closely with the Reserve Bank of India, some of the steps that you're seeing now, to ensure that our banks are well capitalized and that under any stress test scenario are fully able to meet either the Reserve Bank of India capital adequacy norms or the Basel III requirements. We have run any number of spreadsheets, considered all kinds of scenarios, and to the best of our analysis, our sense is post the March 31st, 2016 numbers in terms of NPA recognition and so on, the numbers that we have in the budget right now, plus the additional steps that the RBI has taken, will be adequate to meet all such norms. Of course, as we move forward, as consolidation picks up pace and so on, the circumstances may change, but exactly as Mr. Das is saying, we in government are standing in support of all of our public sector banks, and we will make sure that we have a vibrant and globally competitive set of public sector banks.
You know, this is the third or the fourth, if I've been counting the headlines that we're getting from this event, I think this is the fourth big headline that we've got here from the government, that the measures that have been taken by the Reserve Bank today, or the notification, will add about 25,000 crore rupees in Tier 1 capital for the public sector banking system. And this is going to be good news that the markets will react to tomorrow morning as well. But if I may take this conversation forward, sir, as far as the recapitalization plan is concerned, the Chief Economic Advisor, Mr. Subramaniam, in the Economic Survey has laid out a 4R prescription for the reformation and the recapitalization of banks. One of the ideas that he's put on the table there, and since we're talking about cooperation with the Reserve Bank of India, is to actually leverage government equity in the Reserve Bank of India and use that as a means of recapitalization. Where do things currently stand on that idea? Is it merely an idea? Has any formal, informal conversation happened around that? Can we expect this to be taken forward?
There are many alternatives that are constantly under consideration. There are many policy options available to us. Banks have non-core assets. Banks have different kinds of equity and non-equity instruments that they can issue. There are assets that can be monetized, such as real estate, as was pointed out. Banks can work their balance sheets harder. They can be much more efficient in the way in which they use their capital. So there are a variety of alternatives that are available to us to continue to ensure that our banks have absolutely robust balance sheets, and we will certainly continue to consider all those alternatives.
So it is an option that you are going to take forward?
We consider all alternatives.
Okay, let me put Naina Lal Kidwai on the spot now. And Naina, you've heard what Mr. Sinha and Mr. Das have had to say as far as the recap plan is concerned. And perhaps there was a little bit of disappointment in the market because of the 25,000 crore rupee figure, but the government has caveated that, saying that they will provide more capital if needed. On the back of what you've heard this evening, how does the story pan out?
I must say, I think I'm quite struck by the fact that, yes, the plan was set out last year, the 70,000, of which 25,000 this year is a reflection of that overarching plan. But the fact that there's an attempt to address it on the grounds that that 25,000 this year may not be enough, and to do it whether through the announcements now made by the RBI or indeed the finance minister's own statement that he was solidly behind ensuring that if more was required, it would be done, because I do believe more than the 25,000 would be required. But I do want to also laud what you're doing simultaneously, which is addressing the problem, which is the NPAs that are causing the problem in the first place. And there's an attempt to do that, whether through the SARFACI Act and mention of that in the budget, or outside the budget through the bankruptcy bill. But it is an area that needs addressing. I think the area which maybe has not been said enough, but it's not necessarily something that you have to say in the budget, is about equity raising that could happen, which might lead to some dilution possibly of these banks. And if indeed you're going to chuck this into the Niti Aayog, who looks at and addresses everything from strategic stake sales to disinvestment, it would be good to see it go into some kind of a zone where all of these solutions are also looked at?
Nena, as far as the capital raising requirements through Indradhanush are required, we had run a number of scenarios, and our sense was that the banks, even after taking into account where the NPAs could net out, would require about 1.8 lakh crores of equity capital. This is CET1 capital, not necessarily Tier 1 capital, so it's CET1 capital. So that was our estimate. As of now, we haven't seen anything that would, require us to change that. Obviously, we've consulted very closely with RBI. They've run their numbers, we've run our numbers, and we've kind of still netted out of that 1.8 lakh crores. Now, the question, of course, in that 1.8 lakh crores is if government puts in 70,000 and we need another 1.1 lakh crores, and I may remind you, this is to meet the Basel III requirements of 2019, and it also assumes a credit growth number across the public sector banks of 12%. Now, we've varied that, but on across each of the public sector banks, depending on their ability to grow, but effectively across the system-wide average is 12%. So that's the credit growth assumption that's in there. With that credit growth assumption, taking into account where the NPAs are at, CET1 capital, the question really will then become, will we be able to raise the 1.1 lakh crores from the markets or not? To my mind, that's the big uncertainty, and we'll have to see. I think the 70,000 crores from the government will be forthcoming. We've already provisioned for that in the budget. The 1.1 lakh crores is really a bit of a question mark. Then, of course, there are contingencies with respect to the NPAs themselves and the provisioning that will be required as far as that is concerned. To some extent, that is going to be dependent on certain factors that may not be within our control. For instance, what is happening in the steel sector. So we'll have to just see how all of this develops. I think as the consolidation moves forward, we also recognize that there are certain banks that have more than adequate capital as well. And so we'll see exactly what the Bank Board Bureau comes up with. Just to answer your second comment regarding this whole consolidation process and who's in fact going to lead that, our sense on that has consistently been that it has to be a bottoms-up process. The banks have to take ownership. If you were a private company or a private sector company, just like, for example, when Kotak went through its merger, it's the bank, the managers of the bank, the directors of the bank that drive the process. Similarly, it has to happen here. But we think the Bank Board Bureau can play an invaluable role. That's really part of their charter, more so than it would be for Niti Aayog. And so we will see how all of those consolidation processes play out between the banks themselves and the Bank Board Bureau.
A quick final question on this issue as far as banks and NPAs are concerned before I move to other issues. In our conversation that we had yesterday, you very clearly said that the bad bank idea is not an idea that the government intends to take forward. You intend to address the NPA situation by way of the National Investment and Infrastructure Fund, which you believe can also raise a stressed asset fund. How soon can we expect movement on that front to address stressed areas like, for instance, the steel sector?
No, that is happening even as we speak, and in fact, the interim investment advisor that we have in NIF right now are in fact looking at a pipeline of opportunities. But please recognize that dealing with the NPAs is a multi-dimensional situation, a multi-dimensional effort. Obviously, we have to reduce the stress in various industries. We are doing that, for example, with the minimum import price in steel and other that we have in the power sector. We also have to equip the banks much better with resolution capabilities. They're certainly doing that through the GLFs, the CDRs, and the SDR. That also is something that we are working on. Longer term, we have to bring into force the bankruptcy code, which we are hopeful will get passed in the second session of Parliament. That's another element in all of this. And then third, I think that the private sector through the ARCs and their own special situation funds also have a catalytic role to play, which is why we've introduced the 100% FDI in ARC and the pass-through capabilities in the ARC as well, which has been very well received also.
Yeah.
So by putting in place all these different mechanisms, by solving this problem in this multi-dimensional way, we think we'll get a grip on this in this fashion.
So bad bank, that idea has died even before it started.
We've consulted with a lot of leading experts on this matter. Recently we had a policy charcha in the North Block where we had people from the IMF, people that had worked on the TARP, advisors from across the world. I think the consensus generally was that a TARP-like facility, a stressed assets facility, actually it makes much more sense because a bad bank A bank is a deposit-taking institution. Why would you set up a deposit-taking institution to deal with stressed assets? And the US, as you know, was very successful in doing it through TARP. So I think that's where global best practice is right now, not a bad bank.